23 centuries ago, a merchant who had just lost his entire cargo in a shipwreck wandered into a bookshop in Athens, more or less by accident, and picked up an idea that outlasted the shipwreck, outlasted Athens, outlasted the empire that came after it. That idea passed from him to a water carrier who studied at night, then to a slave whose leg was broken to prove a point, then to an emperor who wrote it down for no one but himself while commanding armies through a plague. None of them knew the others would matter. Meanwhile, in ordinary rooms with no philosophy in them at all, people have always been doing something else, losing tempers they wish they had kept, grieving outcomes they cannot undo, treating a stranger's opinion as though it were weather to be endured. Over the next 2 hours you will meet the people who carried these ideas from a painted porch in Athens to a prison camp in Vietnam 19 centuries later, a man who owned nothing teaching an emperor who owned an empire, a private notebook that was never meant to survive one bad decade, let alone 2,000 years, and a small number of exact distinctions that, once seen, are hard to unsee. One of these 45 ideas alone has quietly cost people a decade of unnecessary grief before they ever found it. There is no need to hurry through any of it. Settle in. None of these ideas are going anywhere, and neither, for the next while, are you. The philosopher Epictetus opened his entire teaching with a single division. Some things are within your power, and everything else is not. He set this out at the very start of the Enchiridion, a short handbook of his teachings assembled by a student, and he meant it as the foundation for everything that followed, not a gentle suggestion to be weighed against other ideas. On one side of the line sit your judgments, your desires, your choices, the movements of your own mind that nothing external can reach. On the other side sits almost everything you spend your days worrying about, your body, your possessions, your reputation, the opinions others form of you, whether your plans succeed or collapse. Epictetus was blunt about which side deserved your attention. The things outside your control are, in his phrase, not up to you, and treating them as if they were is where suffering begins. Consider how much of a single day gets spent managing things that were never yours to manage. A colleague's mood, a delayed flight, the verdict of strangers. The Stoics did not ask you to stop caring about these things entirely. They asked you to notice clearly and repeatedly that your peace cannot depend on how they turn out. A judgment can be examined and revised. A desire can be redirected. A choice can be remade in the next instant. A reputation, once it leaves your hands, behaves however it likes, indifferent to your wishes. This is not resignation. It is closer to triage, a daily sorting exercise meant to keep effort where effort actually works. Later Stoic writers returned to this division constantly because they saw the same mistake recur in nearly every person who came to them for guidance, the mistake of grieving over an outcome as though grieving might still change it. Epictetus himself had reason to take the boundary seriously, having lived much of his life with little control over his own circumstances, and perhaps that is exactly why he drew the line so sharply. What remains once you strip away everything that was never yours turns out to be smaller than expected, and somehow sturdier. The waves off the coast near Athens close over a merchant ship loaded with Phoenician purple dye, and with it goes nearly everything its owner has built his life around. That owner is Zeno of Citium, and by most accounts he survives the wreck with little more than his life. Adrift in a foreign city with his fortune gone, he wanders into a bookshop, and there, according to the story later told about him, he happens to hear a bookseller reading aloud from a work about Socrates. Something in it catches him, and he asks where he might find a man like the one being described. The bookseller reportedly points toward a passing figure and tells him to follow that man. That man is Crates, a Cynic philosopher known for rejecting convention and comfort, and Zeno studies under him for a time, absorbing the Cynic disregard for wealth and status, while apparently wanting something more systematic than the Cynics offered. Over the years that follow, he studies with several Athenian schools, testing ideas before eventually shaping a philosophy of his own. Rather than found a private academy behind walls, Zeno chooses to teach in public, gathering students at the Stoa Koikile, the painted porch, a colonnade in the Athenian marketplace, decorated with murals of historical battles. It is an open, unglamorous setting, exposed to the ordinary traffic of the city, and it is where he lectures for roughly 3 decades. The location gives the philosophy its name. Those who gathered at the Stoa came to be called Stoics, a label that started as simple geography and ended up naming an entire tradition of thought, about reason, virtue, and how to live. It is worth sitting with the shape of that beginning. A man loses a cargo, wanders into a shop by accident, and finds a version of himself he did not know he needed. Whether every detail of the shipwreck story survives exactly as it happened is something historians still debate, since much of it comes down through later admiring biographers. But the porch itself was real, the crowds were real, and from that public, unadorned corner of Athens grew an idea about resilience that a wrecked cargo ship could never have carried. What does it mean to own your own mind when you do not even own your own body? One of the most quoted philosophers in the Roman Empire spent his early years finding out, because he began life as another man's property. Epictetus was born into slavery in Hierapolis, in what is now Western Turkey. And for years his circumstances, his labor, even his physical safety, belonged to someone else's decisions rather than his own. At some point he gained his freedom, and the details of exactly how and when are not fully settled among historians. But what followed is well documented. He went on to study philosophy, eventually teaching it himself, and built a reputation substantial enough that Roman senators reportedly sat among his students. His lectures, later written down by one of those students, circulated widely enough that they are thought to have shaped the thinking of Marcus Aurelius, a future emperor who never met Epictetus but absorbed his ideas through the written record. There is a particular irony here, one the Stoics themselves would likely have appreciated rather than avoided. A man who had no legal claim to his own body spent his later life insisting over and over that the only freedom worth defending was internal, the freedom of judgment, of will, of how a person chooses to respond to what happens to them. He was in a position almost no other philosopher of his era could claim, having lived the exact deprivation his philosophy was built to answer. It is one thing to tell a comfortable audience that external circumstances do not determine inner peace. It is another to say it as a formerly enslaved man whose external circumstances had for years been about as constrained as they could be. That lived authority may be part of why his teaching landed so hard, then and now. The body can be bought, sold, confined, or commanded. Epictetus spent his life arguing that the part of a person that judges, chooses, and assents was never for sale in the first place. A man sits by lamplight in a military tent somewhere along the Danube frontier, writing in Greek for no one but himself. He is not drafting a speech, not composing a treatise for publication, not even writing in Latin, the language of Roman public life. The most famous work of Stoic philosophy was never intended to have a single reader beyond the man holding the pen. That man is Marcus Aurelius, and the notebook he kept during his years commanding troops and administering an empire under constant strain later became known as the Meditations, though that title was almost certainly not his own. Its working title, closer to what he may have actually called it, was something nearer to himself, a plain description of exactly what it was, a private record of arguments he was making to his own mind, reminders of Stoic principles he needed to hear again, admissions of frustration, fatigue, and doubt. There is no audience being persuaded here, no rhetorical polish, and that absence turns out to be the point. The entries repeat themselves. Ideas about mortality, duty, and the shortness of life recur again and again, sometimes in nearly identical phrasing, because Marcus was not composing literature. He was rehearsing the same convictions the way a person returns to a difficult truth they have not yet fully absorbed. He wrote to steady himself, likely each night or during pauses in a campaign, addressing an emperor who needed exactly the same reminders any ordinary person might need, that anger passes, that death comes to everyone, that other people's failings are not worth the energy spent resenting them. Centuries later, when the notebook survived and eventually reached readers, what struck them was not brilliance of argument, but nakedness of effort. Here was one of the most powerful men in the ancient world, talking to himself the way anyone might, unsure whether his own advice was landing. The unpolished repetition, the private doubt, the total absence of performance, these became exactly what later readers valued most, because it meant the philosophy on the page had actually been lived, tested, and needed by the man writing it. Cleanthes spent his nights hauling water and grinding grain so that his days could belong to philosophy. He arrived in Athens with little money, and after Zeno's death he became the second head of the Stoa, the school Zeno had founded at the painted colonnade in the marketplace. Poverty followed him for most of his life. According to the accounts that survive, he worked manual labor after dark, water carrying, grain grinding, the physical repetitive work available to a man without wealth or connections, and he did it specifically so that his daylight hours could remain free for study and teaching. Athenians reportedly grew suspicious of a man with so little visible income and so much free time, and he was at one point brought before officials to explain how he supported himself, an inquiry he apparently satisfied by naming the laborers who could vouch for his nighttime work. Whatever the exact details, the broader picture is consistent across the ancient sources. Cleanthes chose discomfort deliberately rather than abandon the school. Beyond his endurance, he left behind the hymn to Zeus, one of the largest fragments of early Stoic writing to survive intact into the present day. In it, Zeus stands less for a mythological figure with human moods and more for a kind of divine reason that runs through the entire cosmos, ordering it, holding its parts in relation to one another, governing events according to a rational plan, even when that plan is not visible to the people living inside it. This idea that the universe is not chaotic but structured by an underlying reason a person can align themselves with, sat near the center of early Stoic belief, and the hymn is one of the clearest windows historians have into how the first generations of the school actually described it in their own words, rather than through later summary. A man who spent his nights doing the hardest physical labor available, managed in whatever hours remained, to write one of the closest things Stoicism has to a founding prayer. The Stoics argued that it is never the event itself that disturbs a person, but the judgment that person forms about it. In their account of how emotion actually works, something happens in the world first, a loss, an insult, a delay, a piece of unwelcome news. This produces what the Stoics called an impression, a kind of first mental image of the event, arriving automatically and without much choice involved. What happens next is where the real work occurs. A person either gives assent to that impression, accepting the judgment packed inside it, such as, "This is terrible," or "This should not have happened to me," or they examine it and withhold that assent. The emotional reaction, the surge of anger or grief or panic, follows the judgment rather than the raw event. Two people can face the identical circumstance, a canceled flight, a harsh piece of criticism, and one is consumed by it, while the other barely registers it, not because one person feels more deeply by nature, but because one of them has assented to a judgment the other has questioned or declined. This is a demanding claim, since it places responsibility somewhere most people never think to look. It does not mean impressions can simply be willed away, and the Stoics did not claim first reactions were fully within anyone's control. What they insisted on was the gap that follows, however brief, between impression and assent, and the possibility of using that gap deliberately. The practical instruction that grew out of this theory was consistent across Stoic writers. Examine the judgment before trusting the feeling it produces. Ask what exactly is being assumed, whether the assumption holds up, whether the reaction fits the actual facts of the situation, or only fits a story hastily built on top of them. This is not the same as suppressing emotion or pretending not to feel it. It is closer to slowing down long enough to ask where the feeling actually came from. The event passes in a moment. The judgment about it can linger for years, entirely by choice, unless someone thinks to check it. A wealthy man loses his fortune overnight, and a Stoic observing the scene does not call it a tragedy. The Stoics insisted that health, wealth, and even a good reputation were not, strictly speaking, good things at all, at least not in the sense that mattered most to them. In their framework, only virtue counts as truly good, and only vice counts as truly bad. Nearly everything else that people spend their lives chasing or fearing, wealth and poverty, health and sickness, praise and blame, even life and death, falls into a third category the Stoics called indifferent, meaning it has no direct bearing on whether a person is actually living well. This sounds on first hearing like a philosophy that asks people to stop caring about their circumstances entirely, but the Stoics built in an important refinement. Among indifferents, some are what they termed preferred, and others dispreferred. Health is preferred over sickness, sufficient money over destitution, a good name over slander, and a reasonable person will still choose the preferred option when given the choice. The difference is that choosing it or losing it does not touch the core of whether that person is living virtuously. A Stoic could take a job, raise a family, tend to their health and enjoy a comfortable life without contradiction, so long as none of it was mistaken for the actual measure of a good life. This distinction did real work in practice. It let a person pursue ordinary goods, security, comfort, standing among others, with genuine effort and even enjoyment, while treating their loss as a shift in circumstance, rather than a collapse of everything that mattered. A Stoic who lost a fortune had lost a preferred indifferent, not their capacity for virtue, not their judgment, not their character. The framework did not ask anyone to stop wanting a decent life. It asked them to locate their sense of worth somewhere the wanting could not reach. What does a man read on the last night of his life when he already knows how that night will end? At Utica, in 46 BC, Cato the Younger, a Roman senator famous for a rigidity of principle that even his enemies respected, found himself cornered by the outcome of a civil war he had fought against Julius Caesar for years. Caesar had won, and word had reached Utica that he intended to pardon Cato rather than punish him. For Cato, that pardon was itself the unbearable part, since accepting it would mean accepting Caesar's authority to grant or withhold his life, an authority Cato refused, on principle, to recognize in a man he considered a tyrant over the Republic. According to Plutarch's later account, Cato spent part of that final night reading Plato's Phaedo, the dialogue in which Socrates, hours from his own execution, argues that the soul should not fear death. Plutarch's account holds that Cato read through it twice. Afterward, he took his own life rather than live under a power he viewed as illegitimate. Whether every detail of that night survived accurately through the retelling is impossible to confirm at this distance, since Plutarch was writing generations later and shaping a moral portrait as much as a strict record. But the broader outline, the defiance, the deliberate choice, the philosophical reading beforehand, was accepted across the ancient sources that discuss him. For Stoics who came after, Cato's death became something closer to a reference point than a historical footnote. Seneca, writing decades later under an emperor of his own, returned to Cato repeatedly as an example of a person who had matched conviction to action without flinching, holding him up as close to a living embodiment of Stoic virtue as history had actually produced, rather than a hypothetical ideal confined to philosophical argument. Cato's final night asks a question no comfortable reader can fully answer from a distance: whether principle is worth more than the life it costs. A tutor writes late into the evening about the dangers of wealth, the burden of possessions, the freedom found in owning less, and then sends the letter from one of the largest private fortunes in Rome. One of history's most famous teachers of Stoic simplicity died one of the wealthiest men in the empire. That was Seneca, whose fortune reportedly grew through a combination of shrewd loans and the favor of the Emperor Nero, whom he tutored and later advised, and whose estates, investments, and holdings placed him among the richest private citizens of his era, even as he wrote essay after essay warning others against exactly that kind of accumulation. The contradiction was not lost on people at the time, and it has not been lost on readers since. A man instructing others to hold possessions loosely, while personally holding an enormous number of them. Seneca had his own answer ready, and it deserves to be heard on its own terms, rather than dismissed outright. A wise person, he argued, may possess wealth without being possessed by it, treating money the way a Stoic treats any preferred indifferent. Useful when present, tolerable when absent, never mistaken for the actual measure of a good life. The test in his framing was not the size of the fortune, but the person's readiness to lose it without being broken by the loss. Whether Seneca himself passed that test is exactly the part historians and readers still argue about, since owning a fortune while claiming indifference to fortune is a comfortable position to state, and a difficult one to verify from the outside. He was, after all, never actually tested by poverty during most of the years he wrote about it, and it is easier to praise simplicity from a well-appointed villa than from an empty room. When Nero eventually turned on him and ordered his death, Seneca reportedly met it with the composure his philosophy had always promised, which is either the final proof of his sincerity or simply the last performance of a man who had spent a lifetime rehearsing one. That question does not resolve easily, and perhaps it was never meant to. Seneca recommended a daily exercise. Before anything goes wrong, imagine, in detail, that it already has. He called it premeditatio malorum, a rehearsal of adversity, and its purpose was not to summon dread, but to drain it of surprise. Each morning or each evening before sleep, he would sit with a specific loss: the death of a friend, exile, poverty, his own illness, not a vague shadow of misfortune, but the particular shape of it, walked through slowly in the mind. The logic was plain. What arrives unexpected breaks people, not because it is worse than what they feared, but because they never let themselves feel its weight in advance. A person who has already pictured the loss of their fortune in some detail meets the actual event with a mind that has been there before. The shock is smaller, the grip loosens. This was not pessimism, at least not as Seneca practiced it. He was careful to distinguish the exercise from anxious brooding, the kind that circles a fear without ever facing it plainly. Rehearsal has an endpoint. You picture the loss, you sit with it, and then you return to the present moment, which has not yet contained that loss at all. Marcus Aurelius, writing a century later in a private journal never meant for publication, practiced something close to this on nearly every page. He reminded himself each morning that he would meet difficult people that day, dishonest ones, ungrateful ones, and by naming this in advance he met them without indignation when they appeared. He rehearsed the deaths of those close to him and even his own, not to court despair, but to remember that nothing arriving was unprecedented. Historians studying these two writers, separated by rank and by a century, still find it striking how closely the private exercise matches the public teaching. One was a wealthy statesman advising a friend by letter. The other was an emperor, writing only for himself. Both arrived at the same discipline. Imagine the wound before it comes, and it arrives already half-healed. The Stoics compared living well to shooting an arrow at a target. The archer controls the aim, not the wind. Everything that belongs to the archer, the stance, the draw, the release, the years of practice behind the hand, is fully within their power. Whether a gust bends the arrow's path in its final second is not. This image, used by writers in the Stoic tradition to explain where human control actually begins and ends, does something quietly radical to the ordinary way people judge a life. Most people measure themselves by results. Did the arrow land? Did the deal close? Did the medicine work? The Stoics argued this was a kind of category error, judging a person by facts that were never entirely theirs to determine. An archer who takes a bad stance and happens to hit the target through pure luck has not shot well. An archer with perfect form who is undone by a sudden crosswind has not shot badly. The shot itself, the part that flows from skill, care, and intention, is the only part that belongs to the archer, and it is the only part that deserves praise or blame. Everything downstream, once the arrow leaves the bow, enters a world of causes the archer cannot fully see or steer: wind, distance, the twitch of the target, chance. The Stoics called the things within reach of the will, judgment, intention, effort, up to us, and everything else, health, reputation, outcomes, not up to us. This did not mean outcomes were unimportant. The archer still aims at the target, still wants the arrow to land. The point was narrower and in some ways more freeing. A person's worth is measured by the quality of the aim, not by whatever the wind happens to do afterward. Applied to an ordinary life, the analogy reframes almost everything. A person can prepare thoroughly for a difficult conversation, speak with honesty and care, and still watch it go badly. By Stoic reasoning, they have not failed, because the part that was theirs to control, the aim, was sound. The wind was never in anyone's hands to begin with. A stranger stops him in the market of a foreign city and asks the question every traveler gets asked: "Where are you from?" According to the story handed down about one of the earliest Stoics, he did not name a city at all. He answered that he considered himself a citizen of the world. Cosmopolites in the Greek, a word that plainly glosses as world citizen. In an age when nearly every form of belonging ran through the city-state, this was a strange thing to say. A Greek of the classical world was, before almost anything else, an Athenian, a Spartan, a Corinthian. Citizenship meant a specific assembly, a specific set of laws, a specific patch of land you would fight and die for. To claim citizenship in the world, instead, was to opt out of the entire framework that organized ancient political life. The idea did not stay a one-line reply. Later Stoics developed it into a fuller argument. All human beings, by virtue of sharing reason, belong to a single moral community that has nothing to do with borders. A farmer in Gaul and a senator in Rome, on this view, answer to the same underlying law, one grounded not in any city's statutes, but in the rational nature they hold in common. Marcus Aurelius, writing centuries later as an actual emperor, governing millions across 3 continents, returned to this thought often, reasoning that if he shared reason with every other person alive, he shared, in some sense, a homeland with all of them too. None of this erased ordinary loyalties. Stoics still served as magistrates, soldiers, and administrators of particular cities and empires, Zeno's own successors included. But cosmopolitanism gave those local duties a ceiling. No city's law could override the deeper claim that a stranger, simply by being rational and human, was owed the same basic regard as a neighbor. It was an argument, not yet a policy, and it would take many centuries before anything like universal human dignity moved from philosophy into law. But the sentence was already spoken, standing in some marketplace, refusing to name a single home. Why would a Roman teacher, writing in the 1st century, insist that his female students needed philosophy exactly as much as his male ones did? Musonius Rufus, who would go on to teach the young Epictetus, left behind lecture notes that argue precisely this. Women have the same capacity for virtue as men, the same aptitude for reason, and therefore the same right and the same responsibility to study philosophy in earnest. This was not a passing aside. Musonius laid out the argument directly. If courage, justice, and self-control are qualities of the rational mind rather than the male body, and the Stoics held firmly that they were, then a woman's mind is equipped for them just as fully. He rejected the common assumption of his time that philosophy was a male luxury, arguing instead that a woman untrained in it was left more vulnerable to fear, grief, and poor judgment, not less capable of overcoming them. Well over 1,000 years before this became anything like a common opinion, he was teaching it as settled doctrine in his own school. This fits a wider pattern in how Musonius taught. He had little patience for philosophy as clever argument or abstract theory. He measured a lesson by whether it changed how a person actually lived, what they ate, how they dressed, how they treated a spouse or a slave, how they bore hardship. Students reportedly found him demanding, even severe, because he treated philosophy as training for daily conduct rather than a subject for debate. His insistence on educating women grew out of that same practical instinct. Virtue was something exercised in a household, in a marriage, in the raising of children, and a woman untrained in reasoning well was, in his view, simply less equipped for a life every bit as demanding as a man's. His arguments survive only because students transcribe them, and some scholars note we likely have an incomplete and second-hand record of his actual words. Even so, the position itself is unmistakable, sitting in the historical record, centuries ahead of its time, waiting for the world to catch up. His owner is twisting his leg, slowly, testing how far it will bend before something gives. The enslaved man watching this happen to his own body says, without raising his voice, that if his owner keeps going, the leg will break. The owner continues. The leg breaks. According to the account preserved by the early Christian writer Origen, the man did not cry out, did not flinch, and simply observed, in the same level tone as before, that he had told him this would happen. That man was Epictetus, who would later become one of the most influential Stoic teachers in the Roman world, though at the time of this story he was still enslaved and had not yet taught a single lesson. Origen was writing generations after the fact, and some scholars suspect the episode had already hardened into legend by the time he recorded it. The sort of story that gets told about a famous teacher, regardless of whether every detail happened exactly so. But whether the leg injury unfolded in precise fact as described, or was shaped over the years into a fitting emblem of the man's later teaching, it endures for a reason. It stages, in a single moment, the division that would sit at the center of everything Epictetus later taught. The body can be seized, restrained, injured, even owned outright by another person, while the will, the seat of judgment and response, answers to no one. A leg is bone and tissue, and bone and tissue are, in the Stoic accounting, not up to us. They can be taken, What Epictetus insisted could not be taken was the choice of how to meet the pain once it arrived, and the story of his own leg became the clearest possible illustration of that claim, lived rather than merely argued. He would go on, once freed, to found a school built almost entirely around this single distinction, teaching Roman citizens and eventually reaching an emperor, Marcus Aurelius, who never met him but carried his lessons for the rest of his life. A body breaks, a composed mind, the Stoics insisted, need not break with it. Apatheia, the Stoic ideal, is often translated as apathy, but the Stoics were not describing a life without feeling. The English word apathy has drifted into meaning indifference, a flatness, a shrug at the world. That is nearly the opposite of what the Greek term meant to the people who coined it. Apatheia glosses more accurately as freedom from destructive passion, and the operative word is destructive. The Stoics divided the emotional life into two very different categories, and the distinction mattered enormously to them. On one side sat what they called the passions proper: fear, uncontrolled desire, crushing grief, blind rage. These were not simply unpleasant feelings. The Stoics argued they were errors of judgment, moments where the mind mistakenly assigned enormous importance to something outside its control, a possession, a reputation, another person's behavior, and then suffered accordingly. Apatheia meant freedom from being yanked around by exactly these kinds of misjudgments. It was a cure for a specific disease of the mind, not an anesthetic for the mind as a whole. On the other side, and this is the part the popular caricature usually drops entirely, the Stoics described a set of healthy emotional responses they called eupatheiai, good feelings, which the ideal Stoic sage was expected to feel fully and without apology. Joy belonged here, not the frantic high of winning a prize, but a settled gladness at living well. Caution belonged here too, a clear-eyed wariness of real danger, distinct from paralyzing fear. Goodwill toward others belonged here as well, warmth extended freely rather than anxious attachment. A sage who achieved apatheia was not, by the Stoics' own account, an unfeeling statue. He was a person who had stopped being ambushed by fear and rage and grief, and who was therefore, perhaps counterintuitively, more available to genuine joy and warmth than someone constantly buffeted by the destructive kind. The confusion over the word has outlived the philosophy by roughly 2,000 years, and it persists mostly because apathy sounds so much like apatheia, while meaning something the Stoics would barely have recognized as their own idea at all. Scholars still debate whether Lucilius, the recipient of Seneca's most famous letters, was a real correspondent or a literary device. The letters to Lucilius, a collection Seneca composed toward the end of his life, present themselves as an ongoing private correspondence, one philosopher, older and further along the path, writing candidly to a younger friend, serving as a Roman procurator in Sicily, offering guidance on death, wealth, friendship, and the daily work of living well. Lucilius writes back, we are told, though none of his replies survive, only Seneca's side of an apparently two-way exchange. Some historians take the correspondence largely at face value, a real friendship conducted partly by letter, the way people separated by distance and duty then and now still do. Others notice how neatly the letters build into something resembling a structured course of instruction, topics deepening in a logical sequence, arguments answering objections that a real friend, writing spontaneously about his actual week, would be unlikely to raise so conveniently on cue. On this reading, Lucilius may be less a specific person and more a literary frame, a plausible reader Seneca could address directly, allowing abstract philosophy to arrive as intimate advice rather than a treatise. The truth likely sits somewhere between these two positions, and it may never be settled with certainty, since no outside record of Lucilius independent of these letters has survived to confirm or disprove him. What is not in question is the value of what got written, regardless of who, if anyone, was on the other end reading it. Across roughly 124 letters, Seneca works through fear of death, the uselessness of hoarding wealth, how to handle enslaved household staff, how to grieve, how to use time that keeps disappearing, whether or not anyone notices it passing. It remains one of the richest surviving records of what Stoic philosophy looked like when applied to an actual particular life, real or carefully imagined. whether Lucilius existed, hardly changes what the letters ask of the person reading them now. Marcus Aurelius wakes before dawn, and among the first thoughts he commits to his private notebook is the plain fact that he will die, perhaps that very day. Memento mori, remember you will die, sounds to modern ears like a warning etched on a tombstone, meant to unsettle. The Stoics used it as something closer to a tool, picked up each morning and put to work. The constant low awareness of mortality was not meant to frighten a person into gloom. It was meant to sharpen attention to whatever the present hour actually contained. A meeting, a meal, a difficult conversation with a colleague, all of it takes on a different weight once a person genuinely holds in mind that the supply of such hours is finite and unknown even to itself. Marcus returned to this discipline constantly in his notebook, reminding himself that emperors and beggars alike end up dust, that the great names of history are already mostly forgotten, and that grasping this fact should loosen, not tighten, the grip of daily irritations. A slight from a colleague, a delayed appointment, an insult from a rival, all shrink somewhat against the plain backdrop of a life that will not last forever. This is a different exercise from fearing death, and the Stoics were careful to keep the two apart. Fear of death in their accounting was a wasted expenditure of attention on an outcome entirely outside anyone's control. No amount of dread changes when death arrives. Memento mori, by contrast, was not about dwelling on the event of dying at all. It used the fact of mortality as a lens turned back onto the here and now, a way of asking each morning what actually deserves today's limited hours and what does not. Practiced daily, it becomes less a warning and more a kind of discipline for attention itself, trimming away the trivial anxieties that would otherwise fill a day meant for something sturdier. The reminder was never really about death. It was about how to spend whatever comes before it. How does a philosopher end up tutoring the very tyrant whose cruelty later became a byword for imperial excess? Seneca was brought in to educate Nero while the future emperor was still a boy, and for years afterward he remained close at hand as an advisor, urging moderation, restraint, and the kind of measured judgment his own writings praised so consistently. For a time it seemed to work. The early years of Nero's reign, guided substantially by Seneca and the prefect Burrus, were remembered by later Roman writers as comparatively stable and well-governed. That did not last. As Nero grew more confident, more erratic, and increasingly resistant to counsel, Seneca's influence faded, and he gradually withdrew from public life, aware, by most accounts, of how precarious his position with the emperor had become. The break, when it came, was final. In 65 AD, Seneca was implicated in the Pisonian conspiracy, a plot against Nero's life, and most historians today consider his actual involvement doubtful at best, likely a conclusion Nero found convenient rather than one built on solid evidence. Nero ordered his former tutor to take his own life. The Roman historian Tacitus recorded the death in close detail, producing one of the most closely observed final scenes to survive from antiquity. Seneca reportedly opened his veins, and when the blood loss proved too slow, added poison, and finally sat in a heated bath to hasten the bleeding, dictating final words to friends and secretaries the entire time, composed and apparently unafraid, meeting the moment the way his own letters had spent years instructing others to meet it. Tacitus, writing decades later, with his own reasons for shaping Nero as a monster, may have sharpened the scene for dramatic and moral effect, and some details are impossible to verify independently. Even accounting for that, the account remains a striking record of a man given the chance, rare in any age, to demonstrate under direct observation whether his philosophy was something he had merely written down or something he had actually built inside himself. A student in Athens once asked a Stoic teacher to name the whole of a good life in a single breath, and the answer came back as 4 words: wisdom, courage, justice, moderation. Not 4 separate rules to memorize, but 4 faces of the same thing, seen from different angles. The Stoics called these the cardinal virtues, from the Latin word for hinge, because every other good quality was thought to swing on one of these 4. Wisdom, in their sense, was not cleverness or trivia. It meant seeing clearly what is actually good, what is actually bad, and what only looks like either one, then acting on that clear sight, moment to moment. Courage was not limited to battle. It was the steadiness to do what reason required, even when fear, pain, or social pressure argued otherwise. Justice meant giving each person and each situation its due, treating others as fellow participants in a shared rational order rather than obstacles or tools. And moderation, sometimes translated as temperance, meant keeping desire and impulse in proportion, never letting appetite outrun judgment. What made this scheme distinctly Stoic was the claim that these four were never really separate. A person who acted with genuine wisdom would, in the same act, be acting justly, moderately, and courageously, because all four were simply rational excellence viewed under different names. You could not possess one fully while lacking the others, the Stoics argued, any more than a single coin could be heads without also being tails. This is a harder claim than it sounds, since it rules out the common idea of a brave man who is also unjust, or a moderate man who lacks wisdom. Modern usage has softened these words considerably. Courage today often means simply doing something frightening. Justice often means a legal outcome. Moderation often means restraint for its own sake. The Stoics meant something tighter and more demanding, each virtue as a precise expression of correct reasoning applied to a particular kind of situation. 4 words, then, doing the work that entire ethical systems elsewhere required volumes to attempt. Diogenes Laertius, the ancient biographer who catalogued the lives of the philosophers, credited one Stoic thinker with more than 705 separate written works, and almost none of them survive as complete texts today. That thinker was Chrysippus of Soli, the third head of the Stoic school, and the sheer volume attributed to him has puzzled and impressed readers for over 2,000 years. Zeno of Citium had founded Stoicism, and Cleanthes had kept it alive after him, but it was Chrysippus who is generally credited with turning a promising set of ideas into a rigorous, internally consistent philosophical system. He wrote on logic, building arguments so intricate that later writers joked the gods themselves would have used Chrysippus logic if they used any logic at all. He wrote on ethics, refining the Stoic account of virtue, emotion, and what falls within a person's control. He wrote on physics, working out how Stoic ideas about fate, reason, and the structure of the cosmos fit together into one coherent picture. Ancient sources describe him as combative in debate, relentless in argument, and so productive that some accused him of padding his output by quoting entire other books inside his own. Whether that accusation was fair or simply professional jealousy is still debated among historians of philosophy. What is not in dispute is the scale of the loss. Almost none of those 700 works survive intact. What remains comes to us in fragments, quotes preserved by later writers, summaries by critics, paraphrases by admirers centuries after his death. Historians have had to reconstruct much of his actual thought, the way a scholar might reconstruct a shattered vase from a handful of recovered shards, inferring the whole shape from pieces that happen to have lasted. It is a strange fate for the man most responsible for making Stoicism rigorous enough to survive as a school for another 5 centuries. The very rigor he gave the philosophy allowed it to outlive him by a long distance. The books that built the house did not survive the house they built. Epictetus once boiled down a lifetime of practical philosophy into 2 Latin words, sustine et abstine, sustain and abstain, or in plainer English, bear and forbear. It is a strange kind of shorthand, small enough to fit on a coin, yet meant to cover nearly every difficult moment a person might face. Bear referred to endurance. Whatever happens to you, whatever pain, loss, or inconvenience arrives uninvited, meet it without collapsing into complaint. Illness, bad weather, the failure of a plan, the death of someone loved, these all belong to the category of things that happen to a person rather than things a person controls, and the Stoic instruction was to absorb them steadily rather than resist them with useless protest. Forbear pointed the other direction, toward restraint. Refrain from grabbing at what is not yours to take, and refrain from feeling entitled to outcomes that were never guaranteed in the first place. This meant curbing appetite, checking impulsive desire, and resisting the pull toward things that looked desirable, but did not actually belong to a person's own effort or character. Taken together, the 2 words describe a single discipline aimed in 2 directions at once. Endurance handles what arrives from outside a person's control. Restraint handles what tries to escape from inside a person's own wanting. Epictetus, who had lived much of his early life enslaved before gaining his freedom, had first-hand reason to think hard about what could and could not be endured, and what could and could not be justly desired. His teaching consistently returned to this same hinge point: separate what is up to you from what is not, then bear the second category calmly, while restraining your grasp on both. The phrase likely postdates Epictetus himself, attributed to him by later admirers who felt it captured his teaching with unusual economy, though its precise origin remains debated among scholars. 2 words, and inside them, most of what the man spent his life trying to say. Picture an emperor, alone at night after a day of council meetings and unresolved disputes, closing his eyes not to sleep, but to rise. In his imagination, Marcus Aurelius lifted himself above the rooftops of Rome, then above the clouds, then higher still, until the city shrank to a point of light, and his own troubles shrank along with it. This exercise appears again and again in his private notebook, now known as Meditations, and scholars generally refer to it as the view from above. The emperor pictured the vast wheel of the cosmos, the endless turning of centuries, the countless generations of people who had lived, worried, and died before him, each one certain that their own moment mattered enormously. From that height, a quarrel with a senator, an insult from a rival, even the burden of ruling an empire, all thinned down to their true size. Small events, inside an almost incomprehensibly large span of space and time. This was not meant as a way to feel insignificant or despairing. It was meant as correction, a way of pulling perspective back to where reason could see clearly again, after the day's irritations had distorted the scale of things. A slight from a colleague feels enormous up close. Seen against the wheel of centuries, it barely registers at all. Marcus used this mental lift repeatedly, not as an escape from responsibility, but as a way of returning to his duties with a clearer, calmer sense of proportion. Later readers have noticed how closely this ancient habit resembles techniques found in modern contemplative practice and in some forms of cognitive therapy, where a person is guided to step back from an overwhelming feeling and view it from a wider frame. Whether Marcus originated the technique or inherited it from earlier Stoic teachers is not entirely certain, though the image appears vividly enough in his own words that it clearly belonged to him in practice, whatever its origin. Zoom out far enough, and even an emperor's burdens fit inside a single, quiet breath. What happens to a philosophy when the empire it lives inside decides philosophy itself is dangerous? Around 93 AD, the Emperor Domitian answered that question by expelling philosophers from Rome and eventually from all of Italy, a move aimed at teachers and thinkers whose independence of mind he treated as a threat to his authority. Simply teaching philosophy, under this decree, could get a person exiled. The precise scope and enforcement of the expulsion is debated among historians, since ancient sources describe it with varying detail, but its effects on individual lives are well documented. Among those forced out was Epictetus, who had been teaching in Rome after gaining his freedom from slavery. Rather than abandon his work, he traveled to Nicopolis, a city in northwestern Greece, and established a school there that would occupy him for the rest of his life. Students, including the historian and statesman Arrian, who later wrote down Epictetus' lectures, traveled to Nicopolis specifically to study under him, suggesting his reputation had only grown from the disruption rather than diminished. There is a certain irony worth sitting with here. An empire that prized order and discipline found itself unable to tolerate a school of thought that preached exactly that: patience under hardship, discipline over impulse, indifference to exile and loss. Epictetus, of all people, was arguably the philosopher best equipped by his own teaching to absorb this kind of blow without complaint. He had already lost his freedom once, and being pushed physically out of Rome fit inside the very framework he taught, that a person's location, possessions, and reputation are things that can be taken by others, while character and judgment cannot. Nicopolis became, almost by accident of imperial policy, the place where some of the clearest surviving Stoic teaching was recorded for later generations. Banishment in this case did not end the philosophy, it only moved the philosophy somewhere else, and Rome's loss became a Greek coastal town's quiet, lasting gain. A senator sits in the chamber while his colleagues vote flattering honors for the emperor, and instead of adding his voice to the praise, he simply stays silent and walks out. That senator was Epictetus, and his refusal to participate in the theater of loyalty surrounding Nero eventually cost him his life. Epictetus, along with his son-in-law Helvidius Priscus, belonged to a small circle of Roman senators, later remembered as the Stoic opposition, men associated with Stoic principles who found themselves unable to stay quiet while emperors demanded increasingly hollow displays of submission. Epictetus was ultimately condemned and forced to take his own life under Nero, dying, according to ancient accounts, with the same composure he had shown throughout his public resistance. Helvidius Priscus carried a similar defiance into the next generation, clashing openly with the Emperor Vespasian over the proper relationship between Senate and Emperor, and he too was eventually executed for his refusal to bend. Their deaths turned both men into lasting symbols of principled resistance, examples invoked for centuries afterward, whenever people needed a picture of integrity standing firm against unchecked power. It would be a mistake, though, to conclude that Stoicism itself demanded this kind of martyrdom. The philosophy taught indifference to death and loss of status, and it taught a duty to act with justice and courage in one's given role, but it never laid down political defiance as an obligatory rule for every Stoic to follow. Many Stoics of the same period served emperors quietly and competently without ever staging public confrontations. Epictetus and Helvidius chose confrontation because their own judgment, shaped by Stoic training, told them that silence in their particular circumstances would amount to complicity. Other equally sincere Stoics reasoned differently and chose to serve rather than resist. What the Stoic opposition demonstrates is not a fixed political program, but the range the philosophy allowed. The same principles that counseled calm acceptance of fate, also, in the right hands in the right moment, produced men willing to die rather than stay silent. Every person, according to the lesser-known Stoic writer Hierocles, stands at the center of a set of circles, and the whole of moral life consists of drawing those circles closer together. The innermost ring is the smallest and closest, a person's own mind and body, the self one wakes up inside every morning. Around that sits a second ring made of immediate family, then a third widening out to extended relatives, then further rings for neighbors, fellow citizens, people who share a language or a country, until the outermost ring reaches the whole of humanity itself. Hierocles pictured these rings the way a stone thrown into water produces circles spreading outward, each one fainter and farther than the last. Concern for a stranger on the far ring naturally weaker than concern for one's own children on the near one. But Hierocles did not treat this fading as fixed or final. He proposed a specific mental exercise, consciously pulling the outer circles inward, treating a distant stranger with something closer to the concern normally reserved for family, shrinking the emotional distance between the near rings and the far ones. This was not meant as sentimental wishing. It rested on a core Stoic conviction that human beings are naturally social creatures, built by their own rational nature to feel some real stake in the well-being of others, not merely tolerate them out of obligation. Caring for a neighbor or a foreigner, on this view, was not an added moral decoration layered on top of self-interest. It was an extension of the same instinct that leads a creature to protect its own body, only reasoned outward until it covered more and more people. The exercise asks something genuinely difficult, to feel the far rings almost as vividly as the near ones, without pretending the near ones do not matter more in practice. Concern in this picture is not a fixed quantity to be rationed out. It is a muscle, and the whole aim of the exercise is simply to make it reach farther than it did before. Epictetus told his students that life resembles a play in which someone else has already written the part, chosen the setting, and decided how long the performance will run. The actor did not select the role. A person might be cast as a beggar, a ruler, a cripple, a senator, a person of great wealth, or of none at all, and none of that casting was ever within their own power to arrange. What remained entirely within the actor's power, Epictetus argued, was how the part got played once assigned. A short role could be performed with dignity, a long one could be wasted through carelessness, a role as a beggar could be carried with more genuine composure than a role as a king performed badly. The measure of a good actor in this metaphor was never the size or grandeur of the part. It was the skill and integrity brought to whatever part happened to land in front of them. This reframes two things people tend to treat as opposites: ambition and misfortune. Ambition in ordinary terms usually means wanting a bigger or better role, more lines, a longer run, a more flattering costume. Epictetus' metaphor quietly strips that ambition of its usual meaning, since the size of the role was never the actor's achievement in the first place, only the performance was. Misfortune, likewise, loses some of its sting under this frame. Being assigned a hard part, poverty, illness, a short life, is not itself a mark of failure, since the assignment was never a test of the actor's own worth. The only real test comes afterward, in how the lines get delivered. This did not mean Epictetus counseled passivity toward one's circumstances. A person could still work to improve their situation where genuinely possible. But the deeper verdict on a life, in his view, was never going to be handed down by the size of the stage a person occupied. It would be handed down, if at all, by how faithfully the part was played until the curtain came down. A man stands rigid with fury, jaw tight, already forming the words he intends to hurl at whoever has wronged him. And Seneca's advice for exactly this moment is almost disappointingly simple. Do nothing, say nothing, and wait. In his essay on anger, Seneca argued that anger is not simply an intense emotion among many others, but something closer to temporary madness, a state that hijacks judgment so thoroughly that a person in its grip becomes for a short while someone else entirely. Reason, which the Stoics treated as the one faculty capable of weighing a situation correctly, goes dark exactly when anger flares, which is precisely why anger feels so convincing and so righteous while it lasts. Seneca's practical remedy followed directly from this diagnosis. Since anger clouds the very judgment a person would need to respond wisely, the only sound move is to delay any response until the initial surge has passed and clearer thinking has a chance to return. He recommended withholding words, withholding action, sometimes even physical stillness, simply letting time do the work that reason cannot do while still overwhelmed. This is a notably different prescription from suppression, and Seneca was careful about that distinction. He did not recommend swallowing anger, pretending it was not there, or forcing a calm expression over a boiling interior. Suppressed anger, left unexamined, tends to resurface later in worse form or leak out sideways into other parts of life. Seneca's advice was closer to postponement than denial. Let the emotion register, acknowledge its presence, but refuse to act or speak from inside it until enough time has passed for reason to reassert itself. Only once that clearer state returns does a person actually decide what, if anything, deserves a response. Some scholars have noted how closely this maps onto modern advice about counting to 10 or sleeping on a decision, though Seneca framed it in far starker terms as the difference between a temporarily insane person and a sane one speaking. Wait long enough, and the fury that felt unanswerable often turns out to have very little left to say. Why would a philosophy end up named after a wall covered in paintings? In the middle of the Athenian marketplace stood a long covered walkway called the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, its inner walls decorated with murals of famous battles fought by Athens. It was here, sometime in the early 3rd century BC, that a merchant turned philosopher named Zeno began teaching. He did not open a private academy behind walls, the way Plato had at his academy or Aristotle at his lyceum, both of which charged fees or required formal enrollment. Zeno simply walked into a public space that anyone in the city could already enter and started talking about how to live. People stopped to listen because they were already there, buying goods, meeting friends, passing through on ordinary business. Over time, the crowd that gathered around him became known simply by the place, the men of the Porch, or in Greek, the Stoikoi, which passed into English as Stoics. The name never referred to any doctrine or symbol. It referred to architecture and foot traffic. That detail matters more than it first appears. A school built around private grounds tends to shape a certain kind of exclusivity, a sense that wisdom belongs behind a gate, available to those who can pay or gain admission. Zeno's choice ran the opposite direction. His porch stood among merchants, soldiers, laborers, and travelers, in the same square where the business of the city actually happened. Whatever he was teaching had to hold up in that noise, tested against the ordinary friction of buying, arguing, and waiting around. rather than in the quiet remove of a garden or a walled campus. Later Stoics would carry this same instinct forward, writing not for cloistered specialists, but for magistrates, soldiers, and even centuries later, an emperor governing from military camps. The Porch itself is long gone now, its foundations buried under modern Athens. But the pattern it set held, a philosophy meant to be lived in public, among people, rather than studied apart from them. A ship goes down off the coast of Greece, sometime around 300 BC, and the merchant on board, a man named Zeno, washes up in Athens, having lost nearly everything he owned. Wandering into a bookshop, he reportedly hears a reading of Socrates and asks where he might find a man like that today. He is pointed toward Crates of Thebes, a Cynic philosopher, a member of a school that treated indifference to comfort, wealth, and social convention not as a hardship to endure, but as the entire point of a well-lived life. Crates lived by that conviction openly, reportedly giving away his fortune and living in deliberate poverty on the city streets, unconcerned with how any of it looked to onlookers. Zeno studied under him for years, absorbing the core Cynic insight that a person's peace does not depend on money, reputation, or possessions, since none of those things are ever fully under one's control. That idea would sit at the very center of everything Zeno later built. But Zeno did not become a Cynic himself. Where Crates and his fellow Cynics treated ordinary social life, family, civic duty, polite custom with open disdain, performing their indifference in ways designed to shock or provoke, Zeno moved in a different direction. He kept the inner discipline, the refusal to let externals govern one's peace of mind, but set aside the outward theater of rejecting society altogether. When Zeno began teaching at the pated Porch, his philosophy asked people to remain engaged in public life, in politics, family, and duty, while treating the outcomes of that engagement with the same detachment Crates had shown toward his own poverty. It was a quieter, more workable synthesis. Keep the discipline, drop the spectacle. Historians still debate how directly some later Stoic ideas trace back to specific Cynic teachings versus other influences Zeno absorbed, but the mentorship itself, and its imprint on his thinking, is well documented in ancient biographical accounts. A shipwreck had cost Zeno his cargo. What he found afterward by way of one uncompromising teacher gave the world something considerably harder to lose. Marcus Aurelius wrote much of Meditations while commanding Roman armies through years of war and a pandemic that historians estimate killed millions across the empire. The illness, now generally believed to have been smallpox or possibly measles, is known to historians as the Antonine Plague, and it began spreading through Roman territory around 165 AD, carried home by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. It did not pass quickly. For the remainder of Marcus' reign, it moved through cities and legions in waves, emptying garrisons and, by some ancient accounts, even reaching into the imperial household. At the same time, Rome was fighting prolonged, grinding wars along the Danube frontier against Germanic tribes, campaigns that kept Marcus away from Rome for years, often camped with his army in hostile territory. It was largely in these camps, by lamplight, after long days of command, that he kept the private notebook later known as Meditations. He never intended it for publication. It reads instead like a man talking himself back into steadiness, night after night, using the same handful of convictions in slightly different words, that death is natural and not to be feared, that other people's failings are not worth one's anger, that a person controls only their own judgments and actions, nothing else. Read without context. Some of this can sound almost repetitive, even flat. Read against the backdrop of a collapsing public health crisis and an unending war. The repetition starts to look like something closer to necessity, a man rehearsing the same handful of anchors because the alternative was losing his grip entirely. He was not writing from safety, about hardship in the abstract. He was writing from inside it, likely losing officers and possibly family members to a disease no one of his era understood, while still expected to lead. The notebook makes no mention of panic, no plea for the suffering to end. It simply keeps returning, entry after entry, to the same quiet insistence: bear what comes, do the next right thing, and do not add complaint on top of what is already difficult enough to carry. A Roman emperor's private philosophy notebook exists in part because, decades before he wrote a word of it, A tutor shared with him his own notes on the teachings of a man who had once been enslaved. That man was Epictetus, born into slavery in Asia Minor before eventually gaining his freedom and founding a school of Stoic philosophy in Greece. Epictetus wrote nothing down himself, but his student Arian recorded his spoken lessons in a text known as the Discourses, which circulated widely in the Roman world long after Epictetus's death. Among the readers of that text, at some point, was a Roman statesman and philosopher named Junius Rusticus, who became one of the tutors of a young Marcus Aurelius. Rusticus introduced Marcus to Epictetus' teachings, and the impression clearly lasted. In the opening book of Meditations, where Marcus lists the people he feels indebted to and what each one taught him, he specifically thanks Rusticus for putting Epictetus' ideas into his hands. Scholars still debate the exact channel of that transmission, whether Rusticus had once studied under Epictetus in person or simply owned and shared a copy of Arrian's widely circulated notes. Either path is plausible, and the ancient sources do not settle it definitively. What is not in doubt is the credit itself, recorded in Marcus' own words, rather than reconstructed by later historians. It means the emperor, who ruled the most powerful state in the ancient world, shaped his private conscience on the recorded words of a man who had once been legally owned as property, passed to him second-hand through a teacher's careful notes and a tutor's gift. Nothing about their circumstances could have been more different. One born with no legal claim even to his own body, the other born to eventually govern an empire. The philosophy that reached Marcus made no distinction between them, since Stoic teaching held that the same reason and the same capacity for a good character were available to anyone, regardless of the accident of their birth. That a slave's classroom words could end up steadying an emperor's mind, 2 generations and a continent apart, says something about how far an idea can travel once it is written down by someone who cared enough to preserve it. Picture a classroom in a Greek city in the early 2nd century AD, a former slave now teaching freely as a philosopher, speaking without notes to a room of young Roman men, one of them scribbling as fast as he can to keep up. Nearly everything known about Epictetus' teaching comes from someone else's notes. Epictetus himself, much like Socrates, roughly 5 centuries before him, never wrote anything down for publication, apparently viewing philosophy as something meant to be lived and spoken, rather than composed as literature. What survives under his name, the lengthy discourses and the much shorter handbook known as the Enchiridion, was recorded entirely by his student Arian, a Greek who later went on to a distinguished career as a Roman military officer and historian. Arian claimed in the preface to the Discourses that he was writing down his teacher's actual classroom words as closely as he could manage, rather than composing a polished version of his own. Whether Arian achieved word-for-word accuracy or something closer to a faithful paraphrase remains impossible to verify with certainty, since no independent record of Epictetus' original lectures exists to check the notes against. The voice that comes through, direct, sometimes blunt, fond of concrete images from everyday Roman life, has struck many readers as distinct enough from Arian's own historical writing to suggest it really does preserve something of the original teacher rather than the student's invention. This leaves Epictetus in an unusual position among major philosophers, influential enough to shape an emperor's private notebook a generation later, yet known to us only through the diligence of a student who happened to be in the room. Had Arian lost interest partway through, or simply not bothered to write it all down, the words that later reached Marcus Aurelius through his tutor might never have existed in any lasting form. A philosophy in this case survived not because its author wrote it down, but because someone else thought his voice was worth keeping. What happens to the universe, according to the Stoics, once it finally burns itself down? Stoic physics held that the entire cosmos is a single living, rational whole, pervaded through and through by what they called logos, a term meaning something close to reason or rational order woven into the structure of everything that exists. Nothing in this picture is inert or accidental. Rocks, weather, animals, human minds are all seen as expressions of the same underlying rational substance, arranged in a vast and continuous chain of cause and effect. Building on this, the Stoics developed a striking cosmological doctrine. The universe periodically dissolves entirely into fire, an event they called ekpyrosis, meaning a conflagration or burning up, after which it reforms itself and runs through the exact same sequence of events all over again without end. This was not treated as poetic flourish. It was, for many Stoic thinkers, a serious physical claim about how reality actually works, repeating itself in identical cycles across unimaginable stretches of time. The connection to Stoic ethics here runs deeper than it might first seem. If the universe is genuinely rational, and everything within it unfolds according to that same rational order, then resisting the course of events is not simply unpleasant. It is a kind of category error, a refusal to see clearly what is actually happening. Accepting fate in this framework was not treated as passive resignation, but as basic accuracy, aligning one's own judgment with a cosmos that already makes sense, whether or not any single person can trace the reasoning behind a particular event. Not every Stoic held to every detail of this physics with equal conviction, and later thinkers debated how literally to take the cyclical burning, but the underlying picture, a rational, ordered universe in which nothing is truly random, ran beneath the ethics from the very start. The famous Stoic calm was never meant to float free as a personal technique. It was grounded, at least in the school's own account of itself, in a claim about the actual structure of everything that exists. A Stoic student sits across from this teacher and asks, reasonably enough, what happens when a truly wise person loses everything? Their health, their family, their freedom. The teacher's answer, if he is being faithful to the school's own doctrine, is that none of it actually harms him. The Stoics made a claim that sounds absurd on its face, that a truly wise person, the figure they called the sage, cannot actually be harmed by anything that happens to them, no matter how severe. The reasoning behind it is more careful than the bare claim suggests. Harm, properly understood in Stoic terms, applies only to a person's character and judgments, the one domain fully within their own control. Everything else, health, wealth, reputation, even the safety of one's own body, falls into a category the Stoics called indifferent. Not because these things do not matter at all, but because they are not what makes a life good or bad in the deepest sense. A sage facing torture or exile on this view loses external things but keeps the one thing that actually counts, an unshaken rational character, and therefore suffers no real harm at all. This is one of a set of positions the Stoics themselves acknowledged as paradoxes, deliberately provocative-sounding claims that only make sense once their technical vocabulary is unpacked. Even within the school, thinkers debated how literally to apply this to actual human lives. The Stoic sage was frequently described as a kind of ideal, arguably as rare as a mythical creature, a standard almost no one, perhaps no one at all, ever fully reached. Later Stoics writing for real audiences, Seneca advising a grieving friend, Epictetus addressing students who plainly still struggled with fear and anger, tended to speak with far more room for ordinary human difficulty than the pure logic of the paradox allows. The claim was less a description of how people actually live than a fixed point on the horizon, marking what perfect rational freedom would look like if anyone ever truly reached it. Nobody Stoic philosophy ever produced, by their own admission, quite got there. Living according to nature is the most famous piece of Stoic advice, and it is also one of the most commonly misunderstood. Modern readers often hear it as a call to simplicity, to get outdoors, slow down, live close to the earth, away from the noise of the city. That reading, while appealing, is not what the Stoics meant. For the Stoics, nature referred to something closer to the rational order that structures the entire universe, the same logos, or governing reason, they believed ran through everything from the movement of stars to the workings of a human mind. To live according to nature, in this framework, meant to live in accordance with reason, both the rational faculty within a person and the larger rational order of the cosmos that faculty is meant to align with. It had very little to do with landscapes or lifestyle choices. A Stoic could hold this ideal while working in a crowded Roman forum just as fully as while walking through a forest, since the standard being applied was internal and rational, not geographic. What it asked of a person was to use reason well, to judge situations clearly, to want only what is genuinely good, meaning a well-ordered character, and to accept what falls outside one's control without distorting one's judgments through fear or excessive desire. Human nature, in Stoic terms, was itself understood as fundamentally rational and social, so living according to it also meant fulfilling one's duties toward other people, family, community, and the wider human race, not withdrawing from society into isolated simplicity. This stands at some distance from the more romantic modern sense of the phrase, which tends to picture nature as scenery, something pristine and separate from human affairs that a person returns to for restoration. The Stoics were not proposing an escape from the built, social, complicated world. They were proposing a way of thinking clearly inside it, wherever it happened to be. When a Roman noblewoman named Marcia lost her son, the philosopher Seneca did not simply offer his condolences and move on. He wrote her a long letter, now known as the Consolation to Marcia, arguing that grief, left unchecked, becomes its own kind of harm, compounding the original loss with a second injury the mourner inflicts on themselves. Marcia had reportedly been grieving for years by the time Seneca wrote to her, and his letter does not ask her to pretend the loss was small or to stop feeling sorrow altogether. He acknowledges the loss as genuinely painful, real, and worth mourning. What he argues against is a grief that never resolves, that settles in permanently and reshapes an entire life around absence, leaving no room for anything else. Seneca wrote a similar letter to his own mother, Helvia, this one composed while he himself was in exile, attempting to console her for his absence and for the hardships his banishment had brought upon the family. In both letters, the same underlying structure appears. Sorrow is treated as a natural, even appropriate response to loss, not something to suppress or deny, but reason is asked to eventually step back in and set some kind of limit on how long and how completely grief is allowed to govern a person's days. This was the balance the Stoics generally tried to strike on the subject of mourning. Grief was not their enemy exactly. Its refusal to end was. Left to run indefinitely, prolonged grief was seen as a kind of judgment error, a mind cooperating with its own suffering, rather than working to see the situation clearly and continue living well despite it. Seneca's letters to Marcia and Helvia are notably gentler in tone than some of his more austere philosophical writing, closer to the voice of someone sitting with another person's pain than someone lecturing from a distance. He does not rush either woman toward recovery. He simply keeps pointing, patiently and repeatedly, toward the same quiet claim. Sorrow has its place, but it was never meant to be the last word. A scholar sits in a library in Leyden, in the Low Countries, surrounded by war. It is the late 1500s, and religious conflict is tearing the region apart town by town. For roughly 1,000 years before this moment, Stoicism had been effectively dormant, a philosophy known mostly through fragments and second-hand references, until this man, Justus Lipsius, built something new directly on its foundations. Lipsius was a classical scholar, deeply read in Roman texts, and he saw in the old Stoic writers something his own era badly needed, a way to stay upright while the ground kept shaking. He called his revival Neo-Stoicism, a term that simply means a new Stoicism, and it took the old Greek and Roman ideas about reason, endurance, and what lies within a person's control and set them inside a Christian framework that his European readers could recognize. His central work, titled On Constancy, was written explicitly to console people living through the religious wars of his time. It argued that public disasters, however severe, should not be allowed to unseat a person's inner steadiness, and it drew heavily on Seneca, the Roman Stoic whose letters Lipsius had studied closely. The book found an eager audience. People wanted, understandably, a way to hold themselves together when the news from the next town over was always bad. Lipsius was not simply popularizing old ideas, he was editing them, publishing careful new editions of Seneca and Tacitus that later scholars would rely on for generations. In doing this editorial work, he helped preserve texts and arguments that might otherwise have stayed buried in monastery libraries, read by almost no one. Historians generally credit this period, and Lipsius specifically, with helping carry Stoic philosophy across the gap between antiquity and the modern world, not as a museum piece, but as something still being used, still being tested against real suffering. Without that bridge, much of what later readers came to associate with Stoic thought might have stayed a scholar's footnote rather than a living tradition. The war outside his window ended, eventually, as wars do. The ideas he gathered up did not. What actually disturbs a person, the event itself, or the judgment they form about it? A philosopher born into slavery in the 1st century answered this question in a single line that would echo for nearly 2,000 years. His name was Epictetus, and having lived much of his early life in bondage, before eventually gaining his freedom, he built his philosophy around a sharp distinction between what is within a person's control and what is not. His claim was this: people are disturbed not by events themselves, but by the opinions they hold about those events. A death, a loss, an insult, none of these carry suffering built into them automatically. The suffering arrives through the judgment layered on top. This idea sat quietly in philosophical texts for centuries, read by scholars and the occasional curious soldier, until the 20th century, when an American psychologist named Albert Ellis was developing a new approach to treating anxiety and depression. Ellis credited Epictetus directly as an influence on what became known as cognitive therapy, the idea that changing distorted thoughts about a situation could change the emotional suffering attached to it. This is a real and acknowledged lineage, not a myth invented after the fact. Ellis himself pointed back to the old Stoic line as an early statement of the same insight his clinical work was built around. It would be an overstatement, though, to describe this as some unbroken chain passed hand to hand across 20 centuries. Ellis was working from translated texts, filtered through later philosophy and his own clinical observations, not directly channeling a first-century teacher. The connection is real, but it runs through libraries and scholarship rather than any direct transmission. What makes the line durable is not that it was first, but that it kept turning out to be useful, tested independently by people who were not trying to prove Epictetus right, only trying to help someone stop suffering quite so much over things they could not undo. A formerly enslaved man, thinking carefully about what was and was not his to control, ended up handing modern medicine one of its working tools. He never could have imagined the shape it would eventually take. A young naval officer sits in a Stanford classroom, working through a short, difficult book by a philosopher who had once been enslaved. He has no way of knowing yet what this reading will cost him or save him. This was James Stokedale, who studied Epictetus and Enchiridion, a short handbook of Stoic teaching whose Greek title simply means something like a thing held in the hand, before his deployment to Vietnam. Years later, his plane was shot down over enemy territory, and he was captured and held for more than 7 years as a prisoner of war. Much of that time at the prison the Americans called the Hanoi Hilton, where he endured repeated torture and long stretches of isolation. Stokedale later wrote and spoke about how directly that early study shaped his ability to endure what followed. The handbook's central teaching, that some things lie within a person's power and others do not, and that peace comes from correctly sorting one from the other, became something closer to a survival tool than an academic idea. He could not control his captors, the duration of his imprisonment, or the pain inflicted on him. What remained his, even in a cell, was his judgment about his own situation and his choices about how to respond to it. In reflections written after the war, Stokedale was notably specific about which parts of Stoic philosophy actually held up under that kind of pressure, and which parts felt thinner once tested against real torture. He respected the philosophy's honesty about hardship, rather than any promise of quick relief from it. He did not describe Epictetus as a comfort so much as a discipline, something that gave structure to a mind that could easily have come apart from the strain and the not knowing. Other prisoners in the same camps later spoke of the discipline he brought back to the group, tapping out codes on cell walls, holding a fractured community together on principles that trace straight back to that seminar room. A short book, easy to carry, entirely idea rather than object, made the difference between a man who broke and one who did not. Stoicism and Epicureanism were founded within a few decades of each other in the very same city, and arrived at almost opposite views of what a good life required. Athens, in the years following the death of Alexander the Great, was home to both schools, teaching within walking distance of one another, and their disagreement became one of the defining rivalries of ancient philosophy. The Stoics, following Zeno of Citium, held that virtue was the only true good, the only thing that could never be turned to bad use, and that everything else, health, wealth, reputation, pleasure, was at best indifferent, useful perhaps but never necessary for a good life. The Epicureans, following Epicurus, held instead that pleasure was the highest good, though this claim is often misunderstood. Epicurean pleasure did not mean indulgence or excess. It meant something closer to freedom from pain and disturbance, a calm and stable state Epictetus called ataraxia, a Greek term meaning freedom from disturbance. Wild feasting and unchecked appetite, in his view, tended to produce more suffering than relief, so the wise Epicurean lived simply, avoided unnecessary desires, and found greater pleasure in a quiet life among friends than in any grand excess. This is where the popular caricature of Epicureans as pleasure-seeking hedonists breaks down. The actual philosophy prized restraint nearly as much as the Stoics did. Despite their public rivalry and centuries of being set against each other in philosophical debate, the two schools actually agreed on more than their reputations suggest. Both distrusted the endless pursuit of wealth and status. Both prized a settled, undisturbed mind over external success. Both taught that most human suffering came from wanting things that were not necessary and fearing things that were not, in the end, so fearsome. Where they parted ways was on what to call the goal and how directly virtue and pleasure related to each other, a real disagreement, but a narrower one than their ancient reputation as opposites would suggest. Two schools born blocks apart ended up walking closer to the same road than either side, arguing loudly across it, ever seemed to notice. Much of what is known today about the earliest Stoics comes from a single biographer writing centuries after every one of them was dead. His name was Diogenes Laertius, and remarkably little is known about the man himself, not even his exact dates with any certainty, only that he compiled his work, Lives of Eminent Philosophers, sometime in the 3rd century AD, drawing together the biographies and sayings of Greek thinkers stretching back hundreds of years before his own lifetime. For the founding Stoics, Zeno of Citium, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus, his account is the primary surviving source for basic biographical details, where they came from, how they came to philosophy, how they were said to have died. Without his compilation, entire lives would likely have vanished from the record altogether. The trouble is that Diogenes Laertius was not a rigorous historian by modern standards, or even careful standards for his own time. He gathered material from many earlier sources of wildly varying reliability, and he had a clear taste for anecdote over documented fact, favoring vivid, memorable stories over confirmed detail. Some of what he reports about Zeno's shipwreck on the way to Athens, or the eccentric habits of Chrysippus, reads more like the kind of story that circulates about a famous person after death than something anyone actually witnessed. Scholars today generally treat his work with real caution, cross-checking his claims against other fragments where they exist, and openly acknowledging that some of it is likely embellishment or second-hand gossip passed along as fact. And yet the alternative to using him carefully is not having better sources, it is having far fewer sources at all. Most of what modern readers know about how the early Stoa actually functioned as a school, who taught whom, what they were said to have believed before their own writings were mostly lost, traces back through his pages. He is an imperfect witness, prone to exaggeration, occasionally careless. He is also, for long stretches of this history, the only witness there is. A Roman senator sits at his writing desk, composing philosophical dialogues in Latin, translating and summarizing Greek ideas for readers who would never read the originals. He does this not as a member of the school he is describing, but as an outsider studying it from the edges. This was Cicero, the Roman statesman and orator, and though he was never himself a Stoic, more sympathetic in his own thinking to a rival school known as academic skepticism, he ended up preserving more of early Stoic philosophy than most Stoics themselves managed to. Cicero studied the major Greek schools of his day carefully, including Stoicism, and wrote extensively about their doctrines and disagreements in works meant to bring Greek philosophy to a Roman audience unfamiliar with the originals. In doing so, he recorded arguments, technical distinctions, and specific doctrines from early Stoic thinkers like Chrysippus, whose own voluminous writings were later lost almost entirely, surviving today only in fragments quoted by other authors. Cicero's summaries, written by a skeptical outsider rather than a devoted follower, became one of the main surviving windows into what those early lost texts actually argued. This is a strange kind of debt for later readers of Stoicism to carry. The clearest second-hand account of the early school's logic and ethics comes not from a disciple defending the tradition, but from a critic explaining it fairly enough to argue against it properly. Cicero wanted his Roman readers to understand Stoic positions well enough to weigh them against other schools, which meant representing them with a kind of careful accuracy that outlasted the originals. Historians studying early Stoicism today still lean on his accounts for details that would otherwise be unrecoverable, treating an outsider's summary as closer to primary evidence than anyone at the time might have expected. The philosophy survived, in part, because someone who did not fully believe it thought it was worth explaining well. Is it possible to be almost good? The Stoics answered no, and they meant it as more than a rhetorical flourish. Their position was that virtue admits no degrees. A person is either wise or foolish, with nothing meaningfully in between. The comparison the Stoics themselves used involved drowning. A person struggling a few inches below the surface of the water is not more drowned than someone struggling far deeper down. Both are equally drowning, equally in need of the same rescue, regardless of how close either one happens to be to air. In the same way, a person one small step from perfect wisdom was still, by this logic, simply foolish. No meaningfully closer to virtue than someone who had never considered the question at all. There was no partial credit, no meaningful category of almost virtuous sitting between the wise person and everyone else. This is a genuinely difficult claim to sit with, and it was difficult for the Stoics themselves, not only for their critics. Measured against actual human lives, full of visible effort, partial progress, and real if incomplete improvement, the claim can feel almost cruel, erasing the difference between someone trying hard and someone not trying at all. Ancient critics raised exactly this objection, and later Stoic writers, including Seneca, openly acknowledged that the wise person described by their own philosophy was less a description of anyone they had actually met, and more a kind of horizon to walk toward, an ideal almost no one by their own admission had ever fully reached. They kept the claim anyway, not because it matched daily experience, but because it did something else. It refused to let anyone settle comfortably into being partly good, treating that as a finished state rather than a direction still worth walking. The line between drowning and breathing is not a matter of degree. A monk in a medieval scriptorium copies out a Greek manuscript by hand, one letter at a time, with no way of knowing whether anyone centuries later will ever read the copy he is making. This kind of quiet, anonymous labor is largely why Meditations exists today at all. Marcus Aurelius wrote it as a private notebook, addressed only to himself during military campaigns late in his life, and he never intended it for publication or any audience beyond his own mind, working through its own difficulties. After his death in 180 AD, the text passed through a thin, poorly documented chain of manuscript copies, hand-transcribed across centuries, by scribes who had no reliable way of preserving anything against fire, war, or simple decay. At more than one point in that long chain, the entire text could easily have broken off, one damaged monastery library or one uncopied manuscript away from vanishing the way so much other ancient writing did. It survived instead, arriving eventually at its first printed edition in 1559, more than 1,300 years after it was written, translated and set into type for a Renaissance audience hungry for exactly this kind of Stoic material. The story of Meditations is not an isolated case. Enormous portions of ancient philosophy were lost this same way, through fire, through neglect, through the simple mathematics of how few copies of any given text existed at any one time. What survived did not survive because it was judged the most important by some careful process of selection. It survived largely by accident, by the chance decisions of individual copyists, the random luck of which libraries burned and which did not, which manuscripts a traveling scholar happened to notice and thought worth the effort of copying again. Marcus never wrote for an audience. The audience arrived anyway, more than 1,000 years late, by a road built entirely out of chance. For the Stoics, living well never meant a life free of hardship. It meant a particular way of meeting the hardship that was arriving regardless, invited or not. Nothing in their philosophy promised a smoother road. If anything, they assumed a difficult one and built their entire teaching around how to walk it. Virtue, in their account, was the only true good, the one thing that could not be stripped away by circumstance or turned toward harm, while health, wealth, and reputation stood off to the side as merely preferred, nice when present but never the actual point. That teaching only mattered, though, if it could be practiced somewhere other than in calm, easy conditions, which is why the Stoics treated attention as a daily discipline, rather than a philosophy read once and set aside. Each day offered fresh material, a frustration, a loss, an insult, a piece of bad news, and each one became something to be met rather than avoided, examined rather than resented. Difficulty, in this framework, was never really the obstacle to the good life. It was the material the good life was made from, the same way a sculptor needs stone that resists the chisel. A life with nothing to meet would have given the Stoics nothing to practice on. What they asked of a person in the end was not resignation, not a shrug in the face of pain, but something more demanding, to meet whatever happened next with the whole of one's attention fully present to it, without first stopping to ask whether it was fair. Fairness, after all, was never guaranteed and never really the question. The question was always what a person would do with what actually arrived, the earthquake or the ordinary Tuesday, the loss or the small unexpected kindness, met with the same steady attention either way. That is the whole of it, stripped of ornament, not a life without weather, but a way of standing in it. A shipwrecked merchant in Athens could not have known that his bad afternoon would still be discussed 2,300 years later, on a continent he never heard of, in a language that did not yet exist. Neither could the water carrier, or the slave with a broken leg, or the emperor writing to no one in a war camp on the Danube, worried that his own notebook might not survive the week, let alone the millennium. None of them were performing for history. They were each just trying to get through an ordinary, difficult day, using the clearest tool available to them, which happened to be the same tool, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, teacher to student to reader, across an unbroken and mostly accidental chain that could have snapped at any one of 100 points, and somehow never did. What they left behind was not a set of instructions for a perfect life. Cato's death did not undo Caesar's war. Seneca's letters did not save him from Nero. Marcus Aurelius wrote his way through a plague that still killed millions, regardless of anything he thought about it. Stoicism was never a promise that hardship would stop arriving. It was only ever a way of meeting it once it did, with attention instead of panic, with judgment instead of assumption, with the quiet, repeatable understanding that some things are yours to carry, and most things never were. That understanding is now, in whatever small way an old idea can travel, sitting with you too. What you do with it from here is exactly the kind of thing the Stoics would have called entirely up to you. The Porch in Athens is gone. The empire that eventually adopted these ideas is gone. The notebook almost did not survive at all. And yet somehow, here it still is.